Hey everyone, and welcome back to PDA Dads UK. In this episode, I am interviewing the fabulous Hannah Ensor, who is an expert on hypermobility. So as I say, welcome back to PDA Dads UK. Before I go on any further, can you go hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell? You'll always know when we've got new content coming up. And can you also go across and check out our merchandise? As I said before, all proceeds of merchandise are going directly to the PDA Society. So it's a really great cause to get behind. Go across and check that out. As I said at the beginning, we are interviewing Hannah Ensor, and Hannah has a lot of credentials that go back to expertise in hypermobility. So welcome, Hannah.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be here.
Very glad to have you here. Hannah and I spoke briefly on the Grumpy Gits, discussing her business, which we'll get to in a bit. But she talked about the hypermobility side of things. So, I mean, Hannah, what is your credential? What are your credentials? What makes you an expert on this?
Well, a number of things. Firstly, I am hypermobile myself, and I fall into the kind of unknown category of you're bendy, but we can't tell you exactly what you've got. I'm quite severely affected, so I'm a wheelchair user, and most of my life is lived differently. But I've also worked and volunteered with the Hypermobility Syndrome Association for probably close to 15 years or so, maybe a bit more.
Is that all?
So I've got a lot of experience in supporting the whole community's experience, not just my own. And for the past 3 years, up until just before Christmas, I was the chair and interim CEO of the HMSA. So I got quite a bit of experience in it, including the
definitely qualified to speak on this. That's fantastic. I mean, and you're neurodivergent yourself. That's as well as being a wheelchair user.
Yeah. So I don't have any diagnosis, but along with hypermobility, it's very common. Well, neurodivergence itself is closely linked. Yeah. So literally half my colleagues, probably more at the HMSA, are autistic, have ADHD, etc., etc. But with me, I've got some sensory processing issues and things like that. And the more I work with other people who are neurodivergent, I'm like, yeah, I'm one of your crowd.
I've occasionally been referred to as an honorary autistic, which I wear with a badge of pride. But no, I really like that. I highlight that because for me, and this channel is littered with it, we talk about the fact that it's so important hearing from the inside and the neurodivergent voice and that kind of stuff. So, being hypermobile yourself as well as CEO is really, really, a good authority on the topic. Can you explain to us, I mean, hypermobility is something I've been aware of and I know a little bit about, but I'm like in that situation where it's brought, I know a little enough to be dangerous. and it's why I haven't done a video on it until this point, because I don't want to talk about something I haven't had the time or research into. Basically, I'm aware that my daughter is most likely hypermobile. She does the tiptoe walking, and she has a very unusual sort of stance as she walks. You can sort of see there's something going on there.
Yeah.
To be honest, there's so many other things to focus on. That hasn't been one of them. But I mean, what is hypermobility in its basics?
So at its most basic level, it's having joints that either bend further than they should or are unstable, so they wobble when they shouldn't. So that's at its very most basic, that's what hypermobility is. However, there's also a number of specific connective tissue disorders like Marfan syndrome, etc., that have the general hypermobility plus some specific features. And then you have this big group of people, as in maybe 3 to 5 in 100, so it's really quite common, who don't fit any one of these known, very clearly specified, genetically identified conditions, but often have other connective tissue issues. So many of us probably do have a connective tissue disorder of some kind. So things like digestive issues, slow digestion, reflux, constipation, all that kind of thing.
Really? That's really interesting to hear. Something I hear come up a lot, people talk about, is the fact that their kids are having digestive issues, stuff like that. And I've always associated with the sensory processing side of things as being a thing.
Well, there's actually some new research that's an article on it in our latest journal that's just about to come out. So if you're not a member of the HMSA, the Hypermobility Syndrome Association, you want to read it.
We'll put a link in the description, so we'll get that on there so people can go check that out.
So there's some new research come out that links that you've got a lot of autistic people who have gastro and fatigue, etc. issues and autonomic issues. That's the automatic stuff in the body.
Yeah.
And hypermobility is the common factor. So really? Everyone with hypermobility, or not everyone, because there are many different causes, and many people within this group of hypermobile people have autonomic issues. And that this is now becoming more and more a proven link rather than just, oh, look, we think it's common in both. So yeah, so you get a lot of digestive issues. It's also common to have an autonomic dysfunction. So I have a condition called POTS. So that's where, if you get head rush when you stand up too quickly.
Yep.
It's like that, only with bells on. I get head rush it's not head rush because it's a gradual increase of symptoms of lack of blood to the brain from sitting up, because my veins are slightly stretchy, so my blood pools in them because my veins are hypermobile too. So then it's not circulating fully, and then my heart rate notices and goes tachycardic to try and compensate, only that doesn't solve the vein issue. So I just feel really, really pants.
Oh man, that makes so much sense. It's one of those things that I find a lot of these things with neurodivergence, for autistic people, there's a lot of things that sort of, once you start exploring something, a lot of other things start to fall into place, and it makes so much sense.
And hypermobility is really one of those things, because I wasn't diagnosed till I was about 24.
Yep.
And there were all sorts of things which were family traits, and I just had a slightly bigger version, as it were. Like I've always hated the beach, because you didn't go to the beach in the summer.
Yeah.
And heat is a trigger for autonomic dysfunction, because your autonomic system is what controls your body temperature. So my veins are already too floppy. So then the heat, your healthy reaction to heat is to dilate the veins, so your blood could cool.
Yeah.
But of course, mine are already too dilated. So that impact, instead of just cooling me down, basically makes me really, really drunk to the point of being legless.
Oh, wow.
So,
well, you're a wheelchair user, so it should be
a very good reason for me to use a wheelchair. Because literally, I'll start off my 10-meter walk absolutely perfectly, and you think, why is this woman in a wheelchair?
Yeah.
And then at around 6 meters, you might be thinking, is she on something? By 10, you're like, get back in the wheelchair, woman. And it's one of those things where some people only have one of the two. Not everyone has both. There are lots of causes of autonomic dysfunction, and there's lots of levels of it.
Yeah.
As well. So, it's not, but it tends to be, if you've got both of them, then you're much more likely to end up using a wheelchair part-time, because trying to manage and control your joints when you're getting increasingly drunk from being upright doesn't really work.
Tends to go against like I say, it makes so much sense. And it's something you hear bandied around, and sort of getting that understanding of how hypermobility affects you and sort of those root causes behind it. What are some of the traits or the symptoms, if you like, of somebody who may be hypermobile that parents in particular can watch out for in their kids?
There are things like dislocations is an obvious one. Most hypermobile people don't have dislocations, but if you have got a kid who's dislocating randomly, this is like a major red flag.
Okay.
But also things like frequent sprains and strains and tripping over.
So what can appear to be clumsiness?
Yeah. So the actual proprioceptive system is wonky in hypermobile people.
Okay, so for proprioception, I have done a video on that. Please do head over. I'll put a link in the description and a card up here. Proprioception is a fascinating area of all of us, neurodivergent, neurotypical alike, regardless of neurotype. It's a fascinating area to explore, because it's all about our sense of time and space around us and how we physically interact with that. So yeah, that's a really interesting factor in there. It's like I say, I know my daughter walks on tiptoes.
That's pretty common, because if you're on your tiptoes, that stabilizes your core muscles. It automatically activates them. So if your lower spine and pelvis, like mine, are dodgy, toe walking is actually an effective management technique.
Okay, so it's rather than being a symptom, it's almost like a
instinctive management technique.
It's a compensation, if you like, for what's actually taking place.
And if you've got very hypermobile feet, so another thing that's quite common is for feet to flatten. Your feet flatten when you stand on them more than they should. So orthotics and things like that can be really useful, because without them, it's like when I stand up, if I haven't got my orthotics insoles in, I have to actually literally concentrate on tensing muscles in my feet.
Wow.
Because otherwise my feet will just squish, and then my legs will twist in, and then my knees will collapse. It's a slow process. So, I might have a few minutes, but
it's that sort of domino effect by the sound of it, isn't it? One thing affects the next thing. It's like, you might be out of oil in your car, or it's low, but that then leads to something else in your car going wrong because it's not getting the lubrication it needs, which leads to other issues.
It's very much, and with hypermobility also, it can be almost not a problem at all until one joint gets injured. So say you get a sprained ankle, and then you limp. And then that that starts annoying the rest of your joints because they can't cope with that difference, because it's almost like the average person, say, has got this much slack in their system. So they can, if they do too little exercise, they'll get worse health-wise. And if they do too much, they'll get overtraining injuries and get worse. And it's like the hypermobile safe zone is smaller.
That makes so much sense.
Because you have to find ways of building as much muscle and strength and stamina as you can, but in a way that your body can cope with. So you're not hitting your fatigue levels, you're not dislocating anything, you're not injuring anything. And it's quite common to get lots of tiny little injuries that aren't really injuries, a bit like the repetitive strain type thing. So sometimes you don't know why you're hurt.
It makes so much sense. I'm a big fan of Def Leppard, and the drummer from Def Leppard, Rick Allen, lost his arm. And so the big famous joke of, the drummer in Def Leppard's only got one arm. But I was reading an interview with him, and he was talking about the loss of it. And actually the first thing that happened was when he got out of bed, he fell straight over. Because his body hadn't worked out how to, he said, people don't realize how heavy a limb is. And of course, having lost an entire limb, his total sense of balance was out. So he had to learn to adapt to that. And obviously it becomes a muscle memory and a natural reaction. You learn to compensate. But from what you're saying there is that because you're making these compensations with injuries. So like you say, a twisted ankle, you limp, but that then has a knock-on effect to other areas of the body. And so hypermobility can become a much worse issue as a result of it.
And it's all about living with hypermobility is all about management. So it's about recognizing what your body's strong enough to do and what it's not strong enough to do, recognizing when you need to, that's my limit. Because it's actually quite common to be injured after you've exercised. Because during an exercise, whatever you're doing, you're often concentrating on it, and your adrenaline levels are up and everything. And then you relax afterwards and go to make a cup of tea and injure your wrist trying to pick up the kettle, because you're not concentrating anymore and you've fatigued the muscles. So they're not quite as responsive as they usually are. And you're much more reliant on that than an average person.
It all just clicks into place, doesn't it? It makes so much sense. And you can see, because I guess the thing that a lot of people will question is, so hypermobility is there. Is it really a danger? Is it really something that I have to worry about?
It's a valid question.
But from what you're saying there is, we've got so much on the plate for my daughter already, and there's a point where we really want another diagnosis and something else that she's got to but I'm also a believer that diagnosis can be a really healthy thing, because once you know something is what it is, then you can put in management techniques and stuff like that.
For me, the beauty of hypermobility is that it ties together so many things. So it ties together neurodivergence, digestive issues, the pain, fatigue, sensory processing. It sort of ties it all together into one thing that all makes sense.
It's like a Sven, the Venn diagrams almost.
Yeah.
You've got these sort of things, but they all cross over at some point and create that slither that is,
Yeah.
It sounds to me like that, where you start putting these things in place and you start to, and I mean, it's what we said so many times. These things are often so closely related. They all come back to this sort of, but it sounds like it's a genuine physical element to something that is often considered to be purely psychological or mental.
Yeah, the hypermobility there aren't that many professionals, the number's growing, who really understand it, because you'll often get, they're hypermobile, it's not a problem. Hypermobility is common in children. It's like, yes, it is, but if they're also neurodivergent, if they're having other issues as well, then you need to be thinking, actually, this might be a hypermobility that if we listen to it now and start building into life, the basic skills of dealing with hypermobility, like making it absolutely fine to have an afternoon nap, and making fidget breaks a standard part of family life, and things like repeated use of the same muscle group wears it out much quicker.
That was actually something I was going to say, because as you were talking about that, my mind's ticking over and thinking, and it's that thing of what can seem fairly innocuous now can contribute and can build over time. So I'm wondering if things like arthritis and, like you say, RS, repetitive strain injuries, stuff like that, far more commonplace, I would assume.
Well, arthritis is a tricky one. There's been some research done, and it's a bit contradictory. So some people say it does, some people say it doesn't.
Yeah.
And obviously it's pretty common anyway. And there is an argument that people with hypermobility plus arthritis do better because we started off with a bigger range of movement to start. Your average hypermobile person is likely to end their life with a higher level of overall injuries than a non-hypermobile person.
And I guess that plays into sensory processing disorder as well, because for many, maybe part of the reason that it can be hard to detect in our kids. An element of sensory processing disorder, as well as the proprioceptive area, is the interoceptive area.
Yeah.
And so I know for my daughter, and it's things like registering pain.
Yeah.
So a lot of kids with sensory processing disorder will go to extremes because their body just isn't processing pain in the way it would do if they weren't dealing with sensory processing disorder. So often that means that, what would be injurious, or we would detect the injury straight away. For a sensory processing disorder person, it would be something that they may not detect that injury because they just get on with it. And so I'm guessing you combine that with something like hypermobility, where these injuries are taking place, but because the body's not registering it in the right way, if you like, they're compounding the injuries.
As one of my colleagues walked around on a fractured ankle for months because they knew they felt ill. They felt off, but it didn't tally. The brain just did not get those signals and process them in the same way. And that is very common. So like there's one of our volunteers who's got, I think pretty much the entire family is hypermobile and neurodivergent in various ways. Like they have a checklist. If someone is off, then they go through the standard checklist. When did I last eat? When did I last go to the loo? Am I too hot? Am I too cold? How might I have hurt myself?
Wow.
And so they literally then go through the checklist, and we usually find at some point, as they try and address everything, they start to feel better.
I mean, but having to live with that must be a challenge at times.
Yes and no. This is why I'm a big fan of living in the body you've got rather than pretending to live in a body you haven't got.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely.
Because so this family, that is what you do. So it's not inconvenient. It's just
that's their reality.
That's what you do. It's like, if you need to sneeze, you go and get a tissue.
And I think everybody has to adapt to something like that at some point of their lives anyway. We all age. We all, go through injuries. I remember breaking my ankle, and you had that process, and you just have to adapt to the situation. And for a lot of disabled people, I mean, Simon, who's on the Grumpy Gits, is a wheelchair user as well, and that came on very suddenly due to a condition he had, and he lost his mobility. That's a massive life change, but he's just had to adapt his life so that he's able to cope with.
And in my experience, you often find that, once you've adapted, yes, your life is different, but it's not less.
Absolutely. And I think speak to so many people, particularly people, I guess, from the disabled community who experience that. And we talked to Aaron Phipps, who's a wheelchair footballer, wheelchair rugby player, won gold at the Olympics. And, he's done astonishing things since losing his limbs. So he's an amputee. And he's climbed mountains. He's, like I say, the wheelchair rugby, which is about the most full-on form of sport I think I've ever witnessed. But yeah, it's that. And I find that, and it's kind of what separates people, I think, is you sort of an attitude in life. You're one or the other. You either are overcome by your challenges and you crumble beneath them, or you make a determination that, no, I'm just going to make my life work with this. And it's almost a mental capacity that's there, and maybe a decision that people have to come to at some point.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it can be sort of made harder by there's no such thing as can't thing.
Yeah.
Because for me, there very much is such a thing as can't. Absolutely. If you try and make me stand up in a warm room and talk, oh my word, can't in flashing lights. So for me, that's I'm like, why would anyone say that? I'm disabled. Yeah, there are things I can't do. But the important thing is that nobody has the time to do absolutely everything in life that it would be possible, that they are possibly capable of doing.
Yeah.
So when you're disabled, that range of what might be possible for you is narrower, but there's still more than you could fit into any one lifetime.
And for someone like yourself, you're living proof of that with everything you've achieved. You've done that. The temptation is to say, despite the disabilities.
Well,
but it's not. You've done that with the disabilities there, and just gone ahead with it.
Because of the disabilities. I only do my Stickman work because I lost my job because of the disability, and I only can do my Stickman work because I've got the insight into what it's like, what you need when you're disabled, and the things that people don't understand and that you need them to understand.
It's one of the things, that's one of the things I've really loved about sort of getting to know you a little bit and knowing your story a little, and obviously a lot more to learn, but things like Stickman. So for those who aren't aware, check it out on the Grumpy Gits. We've got a brief interview with Hannah over there where she talks about Stickman. Now the temptation is to say PEX cards, but they're the furthest thing from PEX cards. What they are is like information cards that people can wear, or apparel that sort of gives you you will explain it far better than I can. What is Stickman? I love that shirt. So that is a Stickman shirt. And what I love about Stickman is it's got that sense of humor about it. And it's got that, it's so much more valuable to me because it's done with the way that it is that sense of humor. What inspired Stickman for you?
It's kind of like completely accidental, because it initially started as, so I was in my early 20s. I'd just found out I was hypermobile and being told that all my autonomic issues were in my head and psychosomatic and stress related, etc. Didn't exist. And then I collapsed at work and was hospitalized with stroke-like symptoms. I thought I'd had a stroke.
Wow.
But it was actually a massive exacerbation of POTS symptoms that literally I couldn't speak. I could after a couple of days I could get a word or two out, but I'm quite chatty.
I hadn't noticed.
And I also get quite amused by things that I see. So I was in this hospital ward, and this poor dear opposite, bless her, losing her marbles, and I wanted to tell these stories that were just making me chuckle. And when she'd throw a cup out of the door anytime anyone walked past, because she wanted their attention. So I started drawing some Stickmen of things like her chucking her cup out thing and her trying to catch the ferry. And bless her. The staff are very patient. Anyway, and I then thought, I'll do a couple of what I feel like. So effectively, Stickman showing the symptoms of hypermobility in POTS. And I put them on a hypermobility support group and people really liked them. And then it kind of grew from there. And then me and one of our hypermobile friends were chatting about, isn't it annoying if you fall over and then people try and help you up? And there's two problems with that. Because one is, if you try and pick me up by my arms, you'll probably dislocate my shoulders. This is not a good thing.
Wow.
And secondly, if I've fallen over because I've aggravated my autonomic issues, the chances are I cannot keep my balance yet. I can't stand up yet. You will make me faint.
Yeah.
You know, I have to do it when I'm ready. But the chances are you've also kind of lost your speech coherence. So if I'm in that state, I'll be very slurred and and struggle to find the right words.
Yeah.
So you can't be assertive, especially in the face of someone who is being nice and helpful. They're not very good at listening when they're in helpful mode.
That's
really not,
isn't there? And it's something that I come across with you know, the neurodivergent community. Yeah. Being a parent to an autistic child, when she's in a meltdown, you kind of want everyone to just fuck off, quite frankly.
Well, that's the way we have a card. It doesn't use quite those words. But we have a card that says go away, because people don't listen.
No.
And sometimes you can't talk, but often it's the other person isn't processing the information you're trying to give them. So we came up with the idea of cards, and then then I blogged about them, and then loads of hypermobile people wanted them. And then people were saying, can you make one for? And that's how the business has grown. But it also means it's kept everything we do very grounded, because nothing has come from the perspective of, this is a medical condition.
Yeah.
How can we support the people with it? It's all come from people with the conditions going, look, people are not understanding this, or this catastrophe just happened. Like we had there's a whole range of our autism related cards was created off the back of a single train journey that someone made, and they lost their ticket. And then the ticket inspector came along. First, they tried to drop hints. Then they were asking 20 questions. So this person's getting more and more overloaded.
Yeah.
They've got no way of making this person back off. Then they're being given hints instead of literal direct information. And then the person sees they're getting upset and does physical contact, which this person it was not a good idea.
Bad move.
And it just went from bad to worse, complete meltdown. Absolute nightmare. So that once she'd recovered, she got in touch with me and was like, this has happened, help. So out of that came the overwhelm. I find this situation overwhelming. I need time and space until I've recovered. I need information, clear, literal, one thing at a time.
Yeah.
There's a whole series of them that came out of this. And then a few months late after we'd created them and she got some, a similar thing happened. And right from the off, it went well, because the moment things started to get overwhelming, she could say so just by showing the card.
Yeah.
And people really, in general, obviously there are a few people you can't help. In general, people respond really well to them because they're not confrontational, they're funny, they're interesting, and they're clear.
They are. It's one of the things I've really loved about them, seeing them, is that they really are clear. They explain the situation so well. There's ones you've got on, my disability may not be visible. And I'm guessing for you're talking about you may be able to walk for 10 feet. I love that you see it on signs in public loos now and stuff like that. Disabilities aren't always visible. But I love that's there. But it's presented in such a way that is, because you've got the humor about it and there's this little cheekiness there, it takes away from that condescending side of things, because condescending can be both ways.
Yeah.
You get people who are very condescending, like it sounds like this train guy was. But it can go the other way when you're trying to explain. You might not mean it, but you can sound very matter of fact, and that comes across as condescending. And it creates this barrier there between the two parties. But the cards really cut through that, because they're friendly, they're amusing, but they're really informative as well. And they put the control in the person's hands.
Yeah, and also that the whole, if I don't explain, then I'm not going to have anyone understand me. If I do explain, it's like all I ever do. So literally being able to just, why are you in a wheelchair? I actually want people to understand most of the time, but I don't want to keep talking about it all the time. So having a card that says, this is my condition, is just really useful.
That's really good. I mean, we spoke on the Grumpy Dads way back to a lady who was, going through, had some things. People come up and just ask her about, why are you in a wheelchair? And it's like they were being friendly, but at the same time, it's like, geez, this is actually really personal stuff. So having that.
You also have a card that says, please don't ask me questions about my disability. I'd like to talk about other things.
Yeah, it's perfect. That's amazing. Because it's a form of ableism that's there that people don't probably realise they're being able in the process.
They think they're being inclusive by talking to you, and it doesn't twig that they would never ask the equivalent question of someone else who's not disabled. So like literally asking someone, excuse me, but how do you go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
You wouldn't dream of asking. I wouldn't dream of asking you that. It's just like no.
It's like I liken it to the pregnancy thing, when for some reason people lose all sense of social boundaries. Oh, you've got a belly. Oh, and my wife used to go nuts with it. It's like, just leave me alone. This is my body. You wouldn't dream of doing it to somebody who wasn't pregnant, and God forbid you do it to someone who isn't, and you're thinking they are. I mean.
It can be slightly embarrassing.
Oh yeah, you're setting yourself up for every front on that one. For people who are concerned, so moving back to the hypermobility side of things. Before I go on to that, look, do go out, check out Stickman. We'll put links in the description. There'll be a card up here. It is fantastic. It's really well priced. And we will be seeing Hannah at Nadex as well. So if you don't know, the Grumpy Gits, we're partnered with Nadex, and we will be talking to loads of people from Nadex. But Hannah will have a stand at Nadex in the Disability Horizons area. Go and check them out. She's fantastic, and the stuff that she's got is fantastic. Going back to the hypermobility, for a parent or a carer who's looking and seeing signs that you've discussed and potential there, what would be the next step? What should they do?
Have a chat with a GP. So generally speaking, there is no need for rheumatology because actually, if you're hypermobile and might be starting to get a few problems, it's actually orthotics, physiotherapy, occupational therapy that are the useful people to see, and those your GP can refer to. So you're much more likely to get a positive reaction from your GP if you're like, I think my kid might be hypermobile. Can we see podiatry because her feet are squishing and I think insoles might help? That's a much more likely to succeed. You might get a very different answer if you were asking a rheumatologist about how everything should be, but my experience is very much from what I see happening in the community. And if you go asking for an Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis, so some people in this big group of, we don't know really exactly what the condition is, but we know it's important. Hypermobile EDS is within that group, but there is at the moment none of the diagnostic criteria have been validated yet. So it's all very messy. Yeah. But it all boils down to everyone in that group has got the equivalent, basically the same management technique, management needs, possible linked symptoms, etc. So there is no need to actually get a specific subdiagnosis, and it can easily be misinterpreted by a professional as medical attention seeking. Yeah. If they think, well, we can't diagnose it because the criteria aren't ready yet, and you're shopping for that diagnosis, like when you can't have it because it kind of doesn't exist yet, which is really frustrating. Yeah. But you can understand where they're coming from. Well, yeah, you can. They don't want to think it's something that I certainly a lot of parents and carers who have neurodivergent kids that is constantly trying to knock on those doors to get those answers and having it thrown back at you like that. It feels like that's part of the process. Yeah. But actually it is genuinely true. Yeah. Once your hypermobility has been recognised, unless you've got mitral valve prolapse or the history of strokes in the family before the age of 40, or a family history of organ rupture, which is usually quite noticeable within a family history.
You'd think so, yeah.
Then really the chances are you haven't got any of the rare and life-threatening versions. You are in this big group of bendy enough to have and may potentially have significant issues. But at the moment, symptomatic hypermobility is the most constructive diagnosis practically. And then from that, you can then look at physiotherapy. And another thing to work on as a family, and you don't need a diagnosis, again, it's enough to just think, oh, I wonder if hypermobility is an issue, to work on this, and that is joint position. So now I'm someone with really poor proprioception, right, to the point if I lie down, I will literally forget where my legs are. Once I relax, once my muscles are relaxed, no clue. Now I thought this was normal until I was in my mid-20s, when my university colleagues looked at me like I was insane. But what that means is, so you probably haven't noticed, but the whole time I've been talking, I've been going like this with my hands. I talk with my hands, and part of that is actually to get feedback. Because if I'm moving, I get feedback. Yeah. But the most feedback is end of range. So when I'm tired, the tireder I am, the more twisty I will sit.
Okay.
Because the compensation mechanisms all run through the brain. So the tireder I am, the less brain I have.
It's the brain fog t-shirt.
So things like twisting legs round the legs of chairs or round each other, or W sitting with your feet next to your bum. But also things like going like this, for someone who has sensory processing issues, that can be really comfortable because I'm getting that feedback, and it's, I can't put into words what it is like because when you're getting no feedback at all, which isn't what I get all the time, but it can make you feel sick.
Yeah.
And you can almost get phantom limb syndrome.
Okay.
So there are times when if I really relaxed, it's like I had to learn relaxation sessions in pain management. And my brain was literally telling me that my hands were back to front. I could feel that my hand was facing like that instead of like that. And it's a really odd, disjointed sensation, because part of you knows it can't be true, but you also don't know what is true, because you don't know what position your limb is unless you can see it. So, but when you've done that, it's like, and that's why deep pressure is such a cool thing. And also that's also why light pressure, for people who react badly to light touch, that's again why, because it's enough sensation for me to go, there's something touching me, but I don't know where my limb is, so I don't know where the thing that is touching me is. Right. And it's like horrible. So so literally there's one time I was taking my jumper off, and my mum just reached over to pull my t-shirt down, and I almost had a panic attack.
It's blowing me away, because there's so many situations I can apply this to. But with my daughter, she hates touch and stuff like that. If she comes in for a hug, that's one thing. She's in control of that. If I'll do something like I might just stroke her back. She might be sitting next to me, and I'll just, you're doing good. And she'll be like, straight out, really.
Yeah, and it is, if it's unexpected, it is the most disorientating thing, because your body hasn't got that core sense of where it is. So it's got no context for the extra touch. So
again, back to that proprioception, isn't it? It's your knowledge of where you are in space. But because and you can see why it ties so closely to neurodivergence and stuff like that, because if your brain's not processing your world around you in a traditional manner, then that would set off. It's like, again, that chain reaction, one thing leading to the next, that would create that real sense of panic. I can see that clearly.
The problem is that then this extreme position that gives me the instant feedback, because I'm stretching the joints, stretches the joints and will worsen your hypermobility and potentially destabilize joints that were actually okay before, because you're stretching them. So, and sitting in odd positions, all twisted up on the sofa.
My daughter complains of a bad back all the time, and there's no reason for it. But now you're saying that
would be the hypermobility. It's about finding ways to get that So if doing this or sitting on my hands, I get that input, but I haven't got anything at end of range. So going to end of range is fine. Staying at end of range will stretch. So that's not a good idea.
When you say end of range, can I get what do you exactly mean by end of range?
End of range means as far as the joint goes.
I guess my thumb, I say I've got a double jointed thumb. Most people's thumbs stop about there, whereas mine can go to a right angle. So that's my end of range.
So if you were to push lots of buttons with your thumb, you probably get a painful thumb. If you instead kept it actively, held it mid-range to press them, then your muscles would ache. But you wouldn't get that same joint injury.
Makes perfect sense.
You can't expect someone to, apply this to a whole body all the time.
No, clearly.
But it's about understanding that this is a big factor. So things like weighted blankets, compression clothes.
My daughter needs very compressing stuff like that. She finds tight clothes much more comfortable. Sensory processing disorder has always been something I've, attributed that to, but there's definitely that sense. But interestingly, weighted blankets were too much for her.
That also is quite common in hypermobility, because if a compression tends to be quite evenly done, whereas a weighted blanket can actually often push joints out of line.
Makes sense.
Because obviously it's not equally wrapped around everything. So things like watching, working on posture with kids, I think it's really useful for them to understand that if you hurt, a couple of hours after sitting in a position, then it's okay to go in that position sometimes, but we need to do it for a shorter period of time. And also movement is so useful, because if someone who's, I am at the more enthusiastic scale of end of the scale for most hypermobility things. So if I stay in one position for long, then quite a few of my joints will just start to slip out. So not talking car crash dislocations, just
sit comfortably almost.
And it can get to the point where, my sacroiliac joints are literally not in the right place. And then you stand up and it's like being stabbed. But moving regularly can avoid that, because then the muscles sort of can realign everything before it gets to that point.
So it sounds like it's almost training yourself to have that as a second nature as well. So it's not something you're thinking about even. It's just part of your routine. It's subconscious almost.
And so like when my hips start, I call it whinging. And then I'm like, oh, check posture. I've been sitting wonky, sit straight, that will resolve it. And things like sitting on a gym ball or wobble cushion can be really useful as well from a hypermobility.
So when we got our kids saying to us, this is a great thing to do is look at their posture and say, okay, sit up, have a look at, and go through practical measures. You can teach them that over time.
And also, it's worth noting that, because we're having to work so hard, we also need downtime. As in, so they say it's around 3 times as much energy is used trying to keep ourselves together.
Which is where this tiredness comes from that you were talking about before. Because again, my daughter's complaining constantly about tiredness at the moment.
And that's one of the places, because autonomic dysfunction also causes different type and whole bundle of fatigue. If you're sitting, relaxing, watching telly, if that's downtime, then you can't be expected to be holding your body in a really good position. But if you don't, the chances are you're going to suffer for it. So actually having a setup where you can be supported in a sensible position. So, for example, for me, that's lying on my side with cushion here, pillow between my legs, another one here so that I can then put my arm on it so I'm not twisting forwards. Another one in the small of my waist so that, again, the spine is held nice and straight without any effort for me.
Supporting without muscles needing to do the work for you.
And for me, it has to be horizontal if I'm having relaxing because of the POTS issues. And mine are quite enthusiastic.
I'm wondering if there's a link between hypermobility and conditions like fibromyalgia. And you mentioned before about things like, chronic fatigue and stuff. Is there a link there?
Yes. Or possibly no, depending on who you speak to. But there is, as in fibromyalgia is a chronic pain condition. In many ways, so is hypermobility. So there are some doctors who won't diagnose both.
Right.
People say, well, no, it's hypermobility. But I suspect most hypermobile people would qualify as having, most people who are symptomatic would qualify under the fibromyalgia diagnostic criteria, because one of the things you have is you have a near constant pain signals with hypermobility.
Yeah.
You know, if it's not one thing, it will be another. So your pain response is going to be screwed up.
Sense.
And then it can become a chronic pain syndrome. Also, there's another level of stuff that I just quite like to mention while I'm here. A lot of places talk about chronic pain and persistent pain. And with hypermobility, that doesn't really fit, because that assumes that the cause of your pain is the faulty system.
Yeah.
Whereas actually the cause of the trigger for your pain is I have actually just had a new injury, or a joint is sitting out of place and it's going to hurt until I put it back in again. That's another thing to remember, that if your kid says they're in agony 1 minute and the next minute they're absolutely fine, they are telling the truth. I call it Ferrari pain. For me, it often means that a joint has been ever so slightly out, and then I've put weight on it, so it's pinched something. Because while it's relaxed, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The moment I move it or put weight on it, it can literally be enough to make me hold my breath and nearly throw up. But then as soon as I've just given it a wiggle and it's settled back into the right place again, and it's not, I can't feel that it's in the wrong place. It's just, if it's bitten me, it was. So I'll have a good wriggle and a stretch, and then I'll feel generally better. And then I'll do the same movement and be absolutely fine.
It's that kind of stuff that makes all the difference. And what you're saying, that, and why I love talking to people who are not just experts in a field, but lived experts.
So there is an element of chronic pain, but there is also acute pain, and there's injury pain, and there's muscle pain. So for me, essential to managing my condition was actually realizing that I went to a chronic pain thing, and half the time they were talking nonsense. And it wasn't until years later I realized it was because they were talking about only the chronic pain aspect, neurological responses thing, rather than actually, no, my body is injured. So actually, I do need to respond as if this is an injury, not with panic, but with respect. I think that's key to understanding living with hypermobility, is to recognize that, this is my body. I don't need to panic about it. I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to fear it, but I do need to respect it. And when you look at it like that, you can start to understand it.
Yep.
And you can then start to also plan for the consequences.
And again, that comes back to what you're saying before, allowing that.
Yeah.
And it's just part of the process.
And once you start doing it, you realize how much difference it makes, and how fun it is. Because, from the outside, it looks like, how restrictive that is. I'm like, have you seen it? What happens if I don't do it? It's really empowering.
I love that attitude. And I think it's something that, regardless of where you are in life, it's one of those things that you can take on. Life's going to throw you curveballs. And it's that attitude and that respect for yourself that really shines through. Hannah, I want to thank you so much for joining me and shining more light on this. I get a feeling we're going to do this again and get more into more detail. But I think for an introductory sort of a session for people,
you've had quite an info dump, so yeah.
Great thing is that you can rewatch this and get some more grips. We'll put links to the website on hypermobility up in the description as well. If you've got questions, go check them out. Do go check out Stickman. It is fantastic stuff, and highly recommend it. Thank you so much for joining me, Hannah. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're very welcome. Pleasure's been mine.
Oh, fantastic. Do go hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell. You'll always know when we've got new content coming up, and it makes a huge difference as to how YouTube will throw this out to other people to listen to. So please do go do that. I will see you again on the next episode, but in the meantime, please do stay safe.